Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to the third of our surveys of modernity, modernism, and its critics. Tonight, I want to look at somebody who achieved notoriety in American philosophy in the 1980s by essentially changing sides. And that is Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty had made a name for himself by anthologizing and editorializing and essentially launching the idea of the linguistic turn. Those of you who hang around academics know that they're very fond of encapsulating movements as they see them under the X turn. Today I hear about the affective turn, but the linguistic turn was something that Rorty was very strongly associated with as an expression of something happening in analytical philosophy. Analytical philosophy is a way of approaching problems that has remained almost unchanged since Immanuel Kant, and it's named in honor of a chapter in his book. It's unusual to have a 200-year-old movement named in honor of a chapter, and that is the analytic in the critique of pure reason, and everybody who has found that mode of doing philosophy congenial has styled themselves an analytic philosopher. Other notables would include Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Rudolf Carnap, a host of other analytical philosophers following Wittgenstein in his second phase, and so on and so forth. But by the time Rorty had both consolidated and forcefully stated the analytical project, he was having second thoughts and formulating his departure from it. And it's his departure from it, the departure which revives a rather indigenous American tradition of pragmatism, a tradition of thought associated with three late 19th century, I guess, and early 20th century American figures: Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Now, for Rorty to pick up pragmatism would be something like Michael Schumacher picking up donkey cars or buggy racing or whatever instead of Formula One. It struck his contemporaries as completely crazy. And I remember talking to somebody from the University of Virginia, an analytic philosopher, who said, you know, Richard Rorty had a stroke and he's never really been good afterwards. The reason why pragmatism is a very important tradition for us is because Rorty assumes the pragmatic tradition with all of the finesse and with all of the skills and demandingness of the analytic tradition. So he comes at it from a very high point of view, and he reformulates the problems of Western philosophy, essentially modern philosophy, post-Cartesian philosophy, in a very compelling way, and says, if we are pragmatists, we will not have these problems. If we are not pragmatists, if we continue in the mode of analytical philosophy, of critique, we are going to continue wrestling with these problems in finer and finer and finer dust and finer form until the only people interested in these things are people writing PhDs in departments of analytical philosophy. Now, you must appreciate that pragmatism was never a modest academic philosophical effort in its original form with Peirce, James, and Dewey. It aimed to be a mainstream political, aesthetic, psychological, social, personological statement. And analytic philosophy viewed pragmatism as having inherited the faults, the vagueness associated with such a broad program, such an ambitious program. the convergence between Rorty's thinking and the analytic tradition, to which he owed so much in his early career, comes in 1979 in his most famous book, the one that Wikipedia will refer to you to straight away, and that is Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. Why this book is interesting, and I think you should mark this book down for your beach reading when you are stuck on a particularly boring island resort. You've done everything you can possibly do. You've had the pina colada and whatever, swam with the dolphins, and then you decide you need to reconstruct your brain. That should be top on your list of desert island reading, because what it provides in a very accessible and very intriguing way is an account of a turning point in Western thought and a history of the circumstances leading to that turning point. Although the turning point itself only became evident 2 decades later in retrospect, it became clear that Rorty had in a way anticipated much of the substance of postmodern argument, that he had in a way anticipated many of the revisions that post-Marxist thinkers would incorporate in their work. For example, the revisions that Jürgen Habermas would make after the 1970s. And in this Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, Rorty characterizes the Western tradition in thought in terms of 2 overriding figures or metaphors. And they would be very, very familiar to you, even if you are not familiar with the centrality that they have in Rorty's account, and he assures us in the history of our thought, in the history of the tools we have for thinking and acting with and evaluating with. Rorty says that the essential objective of Western thought in the modern era is to provide a relationship between nature and our access to nature, which is our experience, our senses, our ability to think, to judge, to compare, etc., such that this access, which can be the senses, let's try and get an eye here, whatever, such that this access is constantly refined using the elements of thought or the elements of the senses or both in order to purify and refine this area, this domain of experience through which nature makes itself known to us. That for him is the Western modern project. Don't be confused. If you're confused, it's fine. Okay. Rorty's arguing that the whole endeavor was confused, but it only became apparent 300 years down the line, but nevertheless confused. What happens is that mind, which for centuries philosophy had conceived of as a kind of agency or instrument or toolkit of reasoning, able to reason about a number of issues, metaphysical issues, the nature of God, the nature of the good, suddenly applies itself to a rather small area, and that is experience. Anything lying outside of experience cannot be reasoned about. You can attempt to reason about it, but if we follow Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you will reason about it and come to conclusion A, and reason about it again and come to conclusion B. So for instance, if you want to establish purely by reasoning alone whether the universe had a beginning or whether it didn't have a beginning, whether it's always been there, you will, through pure reason alone, through pure mental inquiry, establish a very good case for A and just as good case for B, and no basis for deciding between them. So what happens in this picture is that the traditional themes of philosophy, trying to in a way enter into the mind of God, trying to understand the ultimate nature of things, the ultimate ends of the universe, the nature of the human soul, all the themes which had been intriguing from Plato down to Descartes, suddenly become quite futile exercises, where in fact you can make an excellent case for X and make an excellent case for Y. So they fall down not on the content of what they deal with, but on the form. Modern thought shows that reason by itself, as an instrument of inquiry, can certainly penetrate to formulate and pursue ultimate questions, but it will also create the opposite and equal ultimate question coming to the opposite conclusion. Therefore, because of this formal opposition within pure reason, Kant and others say it cannot be used to establish anything. It can equally establish something and its opposite. This is, for those of you who really want some beachside reading, in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, this forms the second part called the Dialectic of Pure Reason. But what's taken over from Kant and what gives analytic philosophy its name is the analytic of pure reason. The opening chapter, which says that the most reason can do is apply, or is help to apply concepts to experience. When it does not apply concepts to experience, when it does not allow us to own experience conceptually and vouch for experience because we've applied our reason to it, then reason is merely spinning its wheels. And when we simply have experience without applying the categories of reason to it, it is not objective experience. It is subjective experience, hallucination, dream, whatever. It has no validity. So they're in a nutshell, and they say whatever belongs in a nutshell, should stay in a nutshell, is the source of analytical philosophy. Now, Rorty characterizes this project. He says essentially this project of trying to make the mind into a better and better mirror of reality by taking the sources of reality, which are experiential, sensory, and refining them until they become objective, until they are validated by reason. That is the project which kept your grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers, and whatever philosophically busy since about the end of the Renaissance. Now, Rorty says that this idea of philosophy as making a better and better Hubble telescope, a better and better mirror of moral reality, of aesthetic reality, of political reality, of scientific or natural reality, is in fact a misleading metaphor that has kept our imaginations captive. And therefore we should get rid of it. But we are so used to this, and Kant's arguments, and those who come after him give such compelling arguments for the necessity of this kind of division between speculative metaphysics, empirical reality, and rational judgments applied to empirical reality, and so on, that anybody who has studied philosophy, and it's like some kind of American bar where you have to prove your ID before you order a drink. They do not allow anybody below third year to read Kant. They believe that the whole of history is working up to some kind of preparation. So first you'll read Descartes, Leibniz, a bit of Spinoza if they're really wacky, David Hume, etc., and then you can graduate to Kant. So like you're working up, you know, from box wine to some kind of serious schnapps here. Now, that is beside the point, says Rorty. He says, this proves what? It doesn't prove that we cannot attain this picture of knowledge or this kind of knowledge or certitude or manage it. It simply proves that we are suckers for good metaphors. This is a great tale. It says that the mind engages with reality by representing it. And like a good painter, as you improve your ability to represent, so you get a better and better grasp of reality to do what you want with. Reality actually comes into this space of access between the world and whatever, not you and you. And you can sit here and police it at a transcendental level, and you can categorize it, and you can collect it, etc. And you can be the subject of knowledge, providing you have mastered this skill of representing. When you draw, make a set of drawings, you are also representing something. It can serve as an instruction for someone to do something out there. Or it can serve as an inventory of something happening out there. So the mind as a mirror, some parts of it darker than others, some parts of it more immediately filled with content than others. Nevertheless, mind as a mirror, and our thought, our criticism, our effort goes to refining the nature of the mirror and leaving no dark spots or obscure spots on it. That is, for Rorty, the idea of Western philosophy, the project of Western philosophy. Now, he says it all comes apart in the 20th century without knowing that it comes apart. It becomes more and more difficult to separate out what he calls the given. I look at that gentleman over there, and what's given to me? Okay, a lump of staring meat and a black t-shirt. Okay, so that is given. And then I use, presumably, my categories to reconstruct, oh, that is so-and-so. He is a person, he's capable of agency, he has an intrinsic dignity, etc., etc. So I bring the two together, I take the given and I take the concept, and I match the two in an act of judgment, and that is how I experience you as a human being. Thank you for volunteering. But says Rorty, the idea of the given turns out to be a myth. Where do I carve my experience down in such a way that I'm left with a raw feel, with a pure sensation, with an absolute piece of evidence of the world? Evidence for whom and for what purposes, we must ask. Evidence is always evidence for some particular question or some particular theory. If I ask you all to observe, you'll ask me, observe what? Once I've given you the what, I've now started to shape the evidence. Shape your experience into an answer to a particular question. So if the given, if the way things are really, apart from our description, is not attainable, if everything we experience is somehow bundled in with our description, then the idea of making fact or evidence a foundation of knowledge, one of the foundations of knowledge, falls away. All that we have are not the world, but world versions, depending on which concepts we utilize, deliberately or inherited concepts. The problem here becomes even more acute. The second pillar of modern philosophy falls apart when people such as Frege or Edmund Husserl in the late 19th century start to argue that we are never dealing with thoughts or concepts. We can never reach in and grab our concepts and polish them and arrange them and focus them or whatever, like marbles or lenses or pigeonholes. In fact, we believe we are dealing with concepts because in fact we are always speaking a language. And in that language are the tools necessary to make all the distinctions we need in order to say everything and know everything and categorize and conceptualize everything. In other words, language becomes the site where all of our concepts reside. So the 20th century in philosophy, in analytic philosophy, becomes linguistic philosophy, and hence Rorty's interest in the linguistic turn, because suddenly you're not dealing with these rather ineffable things called concepts. And where do we reach these concepts, and how do we compare concepts and so on? You're dealing with languages. And we can easily compare sentences. We can easily compare our utterances. And what's more, all of the possible things we could think lie before us in our language. So we can map our language totally. We can map the full extent of what we can think. Right? So the limits of our language become the limits of our world. So suddenly philosophy is onto this business of mapping language, where in the 19th century it was very interested in mapping sensation, experience, consciousness, thought, concept, etc. Now Rorty says, what is the most we can do with this mapping of language? We cannot use language to map language in such a way that we can step outside of language to compare the way language hooks onto the world. The first proof we have that language is so ubiquitous, so fundamental to our experience, to what is structurable or sayable or conceivable, is that language forms our fundamental horizon. We cannot jump beyond language, except with the help of language. In which case we need another language to jump beyond that language, and so on. We would have an infinite regress of languages, but we would not arrive at the non-linguistic datum, either inwardly, in the form of private experience, or outwardly in the form of raw nature. So we have this strange situation, rather like that described by Borges in the Garden of Forking Paths, or the Library of Babel. Who of you read Borges? Good man. Good. 2 out of 30. Borges was Kagel's teacher, by the way, in Buenos Aires. Borges describes these situations where labyrinths and everything just kind of misses its appointment and you are caught in the tools, in the language itself forever and ever. So Rorty says, if we cannot gauge the validity of our language by hooking it onto reality, and if we cannot gauge the validity of our language by hooking it onto thought or experience or consciousness, because why not? A prize for who can tell me why not? Why can't I hook my language onto my consciousness and see whether my language is adequate? Surely my consciousness is better known to me than my language. I have to learn my language, but I'm born with consciousness. Well, the argument is, cheer up, it'll soon get easier. The argument is, according to Wittgenstein, that even the ability to pick out private experience, such as my toothache which you cannot experience and so on and so forth, is a power or feature of language. It is one of the characteristics of language that when I'm using this language, I can set aside a region that I call private experience by contrast to public experience. Therefore, I don't have first-person access to my consciousness. My access to my consciousness or to my private experience is mediated by my language. And presumably, if my language were very different in some respect, I would have a different consciousness. Just as if my language were very different in some respect, I would have a different nature and a different world. Because everything hangs on language. So Rorty's point is, if we cannot find an inside pivot and we cannot find an outside or worldly pivot to language in order to evaluate it, we're stuck inside it, how can we make progress? And in the linguistic turn, he puts forward a very intriguing suggestion that philosophy consists of a number of questions, as we saw with Kant, to which we should not seek an answer, but instead we should seek to dissolve the question. Okay? How do we dissolve the question? By inventing or constructing a language in which the question cannot be posed. Huh? Very neat. That is the linguistic turn. Instead of, with Kant, trying to get to these questions, the answer, and becoming metaphysically puzzled, bombarded, and split, we say, progress consists of a refinement of language such that the problems, questions we cannot answer can also not be posed. And when we have a language in which those questions, in fact all of the questions of philosophy, cannot be posed, then we have reached an ideal language. We've reached the limit of our language reform. Then philosophy and inquiry can commit happy suicide. And we can speak that language knowing that it is as transparent as possible. It has no question mark areas. It is as transparent as possible an instrument. It's like a good scalpel for the investigation of experience and for the investigation of reality. And that is the linguistic turn. Right? Now, I've told you all about this simply because you must know what Rorty gets rid of when he becomes pragmatist. he says that the very idea of refining language presupposes that there is something in language that we can get our hands on and alter, right? In opposition to this view, and if somebody had not been imaginative enough to come up with this opposition to the view, we would still be thinking that language is a matter of the scheme or the form of language, say the grammar, the syntax, the logic, the rules, and the content, right? So say the cat is on the mat. There exists X such that X is Y. There exists some cat such that that cat is on the mat. Okay? That is the form, right? And then, of course, contingently, there is some cat, right? And I happen to be able to make that into the content of that proposition. Now, if I'm going to refine language in such a way that it no longer bedevils me with philosophical questions, I'm going to refine it on the level of its form. I'm not going to find perfectly well-behaved cats and other items, spatio-temporal elements, events in the universe that don't create problems for me because I can't. But I'm going to refine the form of language, which means I'm able to access the form of language independently of the content or of the occasion of its use. And Wittgenstein, when he sobers up after his very positivistic beginnings, Wittgenstein is the only absolute 20th century genius to provide two utterly brilliant philosophies in his lifetime, the one completely opposed to the other. And he said the only possible choice in philosophy is between my early and my late philosophy. You know, it's like rather like James Joyce, who writes Finnegan's Wake and says the reader should dedicate their life to reading my book. Wittgenstein, the extent of philosophy is either my early view where I can logically refine the structure of language and I can hook it onto purified data or contents, or his second view of language where he says this distinction is impossible, anticipating Rorty and echoing pragmatism. He says there are just occasions of use. I cannot clarify or make sense of language by locking onto its content because it doesn't have a content. There is no scheme-content distinction, no form-content distinction to be made about language. It's all form-content. We don't know where content begins and form begins. All we know is that certain utterances work on certain occasions, and when they no longer work, right, let's say cats become extinct and we only have velociraptors, then that piece of the vocabulary becomes uninteresting to us. It becomes an unimportant distinction. And we invent a velociraptor term and protective gloves and whatever. Okay, and presumably they don't fall under other categories such as domestic pet. But small pestilential things that claw on your furniture nevertheless. So for Wittgenstein in his second phase, language is simply a set of instruments for making our way around social and natural reality, for making ourselves reasonably well understood. But there is no point at which this language can be grabbed and we bore down through its logic and then we refine that logic and we come back with a better view of the world, because we simply, to understand what is meant by something, we don't go back to its content or to its form. We cannot separate them. It's all content form. We simply look at the circumstances in which that thing is said. So if I'm standing in front of suitably accredited individuals in the right place and I say I do, I'm promising to marry someone. But if I whistle and sing and click my heels saying I do, running down the pavement, I cannot get married that way. So in other words, by investigating the circumstance of how I bind myself by that utterance, I understand what that utterance means. There is no such thing as a special syntax of marriage utterance or a special content of marriage utterance. It's perfectly void of content. And so for Wittgenstein, language is something that we do things with. And if we want to do different things, we change language or invent language to do different things with. But we invent it opportunistically. We don't go back to the drawing board and invent perfect language based on logic. and based on perfect evidence, and so on and so forth. So this position of the later Wittgenstein, roundly endorsed by Rorty, the later Wittgenstein is one of Rorty's heroes in that 1979 book. This position is the kind of point where analytic philosophy and pragmatism converge, because pragmatism in its classic form, in the form brought so voluminously expressed by John Dewey, who was really what you'd call a public intellectual in the US in the 30s. Walter Lippmann and John Dewey were great pragmatists who invent the idea of the American public, or the idea of kind of linkage between thought and democratic ends, and saying that there is no philosophy to provide the foundation for how we think. We need to take up issues, and we need to deal with these issues, and we need to just clear a path to these issues. And therefore, the meaning of our thought, the foundation of our thought, is how successfully it resolves issues. If we stuck with the same issue for 20 years, or in this country 19, then we're not thinking well. We need to either shift the issue or engage with it at a different angle or whatever. But reforming our thought, being very politically correct, etc., or dealing with more clarified cases such as those which come before the Constitutional Court, will not do it, because that in fact belongs to this framework, this mirror framework. Okay? You got it? Simple, really. Okay? Now what's the big deal? That's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. That's for your holiday reading, if you ever make it to a quiet beach and are bored enough to want to know about the last 300 years of Western thought. The reading which I set for today is Rorty's Tanner lecture called Feminism and Pragmatism. Who of you have read it? Fess up. It's bad. That is beyond bad. You're going to tell me the Dropbox ate it. There is some mischievous person who's always dragging things out of the Dropbox like some sort of subversive leopard. I will give you there are two pieces of reading. The one is a commentary article that applies some of the notions, some of Rorty's notions, via Rorty's most brilliant pupil, Bob Brandon, who kind of brings a kind of analytic focus to bear on pragmatism. The second article, which is also in the Dropbox, is called Dismantling the Master's House with the Master's Tools. You will see it in the Dropbox. It is a commentary, really. It is not of the same refinement or originality as the Rorty piece, but it's a very interesting elaboration of context. I won't deal with it too much tonight, but I want to deal with Rorty's key argument that he gave on a very public occasion. We've dealt with 3 public occasions. We dealt with Habermas' speech on receiving the Adorno Prize. We've dealt with Charles Taylor's Tanner lecture, which is a great honor to be invited to give such a thing. And we are dealing tonight with Richard Rorty's Tanner lecture. And it's interesting that when Rorty is given this honor, he should choose, sometime towards the end of the 1980s, he should choose feminism as his example of unpacking pragmatism to a broad, informed listenership. Now, the reason I've given you this piece, and you must read it, and you must read last week's and last Tuesday's, otherwise you're going to get more and more confused. And your grandchildren will sit on your knee and you'll say, Western thought, yeah, Descartes, I think therefore I am, he's that guy, or was that Spinoza, what the hell. So you must not become a dilettante. Okay, because if philosophers came into architecture and became dilettante architects, we'd have a lot of lawsuits. As it is, we probably would. So the Tanner lecture on feminism and pragmatism has some extraordinary themes in it of great importance to South Africa. And it provides a very natural pathway by which to articulate Rorty's thought, this kind of post-analytic thought in North Atlantic countries, with issues that are very much alive and pressing here today. And he starts off this lecture by quoting a colleague, McKinnon, who is commenting on women being elected to the American Supreme Court. Now, in the American system, the Supreme Court virtually has the power to determine and interpret the Constitution. So like here, our Constitutional Court, the American Supreme Court, in a way are the custodians, but also the creative developers of the Constitution. And the commentator that Rorty uses as his entry point here says, very good that women are elected to the US Supreme Court. This is back in the 80s. But it's not enough that women should be equal to male judges in this very high public office. And it is not enough that women should have the same legal say over the meaning of the Constitution as men. But what we want to hear from these women judges is what they, as women, have to say, not as the opposite or the equal or the whatever of the men who had formerly dominated the American Supreme Court. And if Romney had his way, if you see all these candidates, you'll see pale males are desperate to get back in there and rub out this horrible woman episode. So what is striking for Rorty about this public pronouncement, we want to hear from women in that office, women as women, not women as judges, women as citizens, women as persons, women as ethical upholders of justice and so on. We want to hear from women as women. Now he says for many people, this might seem like a strange demand. Because what more is there to women than there is to men? After all, does it make sense to say we've been hearing from men as men in the Supreme Court for 200 years in the US? And now we want to hear from women as women. Is it not just a strange roundabout way of saying something obvious? If we hear from women as women, are they not just making the kinds of statements about rights that judges and interpretations that judges are expected to make, except they happen to have some incidental difference of gender? And Rorty makes the point, and of course the commentator who he quotes is making the point, that that is not the end of the story. Women only appear as equal to men in the Supreme Court, etc. Equal but somehow different, because the framework in which the Supreme Court operates is male. So from a male perspective, yeah, maybe we males have enslaved women for whatever throughout the history of the West, and now maybe we're giving them their rights. The right to speak, the right to hold public office, the right to equal salary, the right to be taken as seriously as men. In other words, men remain the norm, and women are somehow climbing up this ladder, and therefore they cannot feature here as women, they can only feature as ladies. What men think the opposite of men are, ladies and men. In other words, Rorty is saying that the entire liberal discourse of the American Supreme Court, and therefore of American public life, is oppressive, because it has no space in it except in its own terms, that is the terms of rights and persons, and a neutral discourse on rights and persons, the law. It has no space in it for women to speak as women. And the commentator's point is that if women got into the Supreme Court and started to speak as women, the Supreme Court and the nature of American justice and American society would change. Yes, would change in ways quite inconceivable to the old framework that say, what's happening? It's like an earthquake. Everything is moving that we have been sitting on. Reality is getting upside down, and so on. Now, how is this possible? For women to occupy this position, they would speak not as second-rate and recently equalized men. They would have to speak about justice in a way that focally references themselves. In other words, when they say I, they mustn't think a judge. They must think I, a woman, in relation to me, think, say, assert, believe, and will act on the, whatever that is. It must be something which is strongly referenced to themselves. Now, of course, Rorty says this is very, very difficult for people who are oppressed, and some of you might not be aware that women are oppressed, okay, which is a very neat trick of the male liberal Western discourse. Why would women be oppressed? The knowing subject that we drew just now is neutral. Nature presumably is neutral. Why should women be oppressed? Women are oppressed because they have been excluded from speaking about themselves and others from a certain point of view, from a certain accepted point of view. They've been allowed to approach this point of view only because this point of view has opened the doors for them from the inside. And there is no guarantee that once they're in here, they are speaking as women or able to reference themselves. They may be in there. As the Black Panthers said when they were asked, what is the role of women in your movement? He said, chicks make great coffee. Okay? It could be that chicks make the Supreme Court look more egalitarian and make great coffee. Or vote with us. Okay? So the fact is that coming onto this territory, unless you're able to make this territory your own and speak from the center of authority, you are in fact becoming ventriloquist dummy. Right? So the commentator is saying, and Rorty is soundly endorsing for very good pragmatist reasons. In fact, his way of introducing pragmatism to America, to the world, is through this example. He's saying that if women got in here and spoke as women, this system would blow apart. If women merely get in there and speak as judges, the system might carry on, but they've turned into honorary men. Okay? And they've let men turn them into honorary men. It's one thing if they elected to turn themselves into honorary men on the basis of some historical whim. But for them to be in here is to be basically thinking like men, because the terms they are offered are neutral terms. It's not that the American legal system is particularly male-centric. It is neutral. But it is a neutrality from the point of view of whom? Where is this neutrality? It's a neutrality which men find a satisfactory neutrality. It's a neutrality of persons and of citizens. And they're saying, after all, persons and citizens are not necessarily gendered, and the way rights are distributed or allocated to persons and citizens is blind, like all justice. It's gender blind. But the very discourse of a neutrality is itself a feature of male dominant discourse. How do we know that? Because if, says Rorty, you set up a framework, and we saw with both Habermas and his three frameworks up here, and with Taylor, his idea of a factual, neutral individual, non-cultural world, a neutrality, exactly this, neutrality. We saw that in this neutrality, things are set up in such a way that anybody who dissents, anybody who wants to differ, anyone who imagines the world in a different way, comes across as crazy. If you have set up something that works for you and your group, say the West after the Enlightenment, or its little offshoot, colonial adventures, the empires in which the blood never dries. If you have set that up, you can even reform it to the point where you have constitutions, you have full rights, you have full franchise, you have neutrality, as we have here. But it remains 100% set up in your terms. It's merely extended by adding pieces from your Lego set. And whoever you are, you still in fact have the lion's share of the understanding and the voice. You are still automatically referenced by everything that happens in the system. Whereas if you set up your oppressive or excluding system very well, anybody who dissents is bound to sound crazy. That, says Rorty, is a very good measure of whether a system is oppressive or not. Now, oppressive systems, thousands of years into the history of oppression, oppressive systems don't walk around with oppressive system on their forehead. They walk around with tremendous user-friendliness. Rorty is saying nothing other than the US Supreme Court, which is supposed to be the most egalitarian and neutral site in the whole of the nation, in fact is androcentric, and that it would be almost impossible for women to speak as women in there. Because if women did speak as women in there, they would appear to be crazy. They would appear to be challenging the universality and the neutrality of concepts of rights and justice. They would appear to be introducing a bias into this situation, because from the point of view of that situation, any change can only seem like a bias. If it thinks of itself as the height of neutrality, any change can only be going down, can only be a decline. So Rorty's point is that any good oppressor sets up a system that seems very fair, but the proof that the system remains oppressive is that certain statements, certain imaginings, certain aspirations can only seem either meaningless or crazy within the system. They can gain no traction in it. Now, when we're talking about women, we are not talking about some marginal group in American society who insist on some kind of extraordinary recognition for their experience, their aspirations, and their beliefs. Say, Hare Krishna followers or radical vegans or members of the Velvet Underground, those chaps who form clubs to beat each other up and their wives. You've seen Pulp Fiction with the Gimp and all that. That is the Velvet Underground. You may know it as a band. It only calls itself a band in order to reference this underground of sadomasochists. In good American fashion, they form associations. Can you imagine? Forming associations so you can all be very sociable and kinky. So this is not a demand, not a demand on the part of the Velvet Underground or radical vegans or people who believe humans have come from Venus or Mars or whatever for equal recognition. It is a demand of 52% of Americans, women. And women in America and the whole of feminism is asserting that what you call equal rights or what you want to offer us as equal rights is really trading rabbits for horses. There's nothing equal about it, even though you've sincerely formulated it as equal on your terms. In fact, because we cannot assert the same thing, sincerely and authentically referencing ourselves, it is not equal. And when women say that, good, reasonable liberals say, but that is not objective, that's subjective, that's daft. How much more do you want? What else can I give you? Do you want an androcentric Supreme Court to yield to a gynocentric Supreme Court that now favors women? And women would say, no, we just want to speak as ourselves and not speak as adjunct features of your reality. So even neutrality comes under attack. Why? Because even though it seems neutral and universal, there are some people who simply cannot say anything or do anything or want anything in that system without having to reference themselves in a double way, in a divided way. Therefore, one part of themselves has a reservation and feels it would not be taken seriously or recognized in the system. The other part of themselves that goes to Harvard Law School, becomes a judge, gets a great CV, has a big network, etc., and goes and mixes it up with the boys and gets to the Supreme Court, feels that it could be recognized and taken seriously in that system and has been elected in that system, but in fact it's not me. What do I do with the rest of me? So it is this condition, this maddening condition of having to manage a split identity that Rorty uses to indict the Western modern view that our culture is neutral, that our world is factual, that we've transcended culture, that there are no versions, but we are just saying things as they are and sincerely expressing ourselves as we are. And if we're equal, we're equal. In the eyes of the law, we're equal. There it is. He's saying that that is a myth. In fact, and we know from Taylor, it is a cultural myth. We know from Habermas it's a myth that only works in certain regions where a certain kind of rationality can be established. It works for our knowledge of nature. It works for our politics, for our understanding of how the state and rights work. But we saw even early with Habermas that the aesthetic realm keeps overflowing it and keeps producing new norms and non-rational norms, and it seems to overflow these areas and seems to suggest that, in fact, the modern experience is through and through the experience of a culture, the experience of a certain group, the experience of a group bound to itself, and a group which is heard only by asserting itself, right? So if we go back to the issue of a divided identity and this important notion in this article of speaking in a way that references yourself. In speaking, you are asserting yourself in that speaking, as opposed to speaking in a ventriloquist way, right? Then the argument quickly latches onto the colonial experience. Because in the colonial experience, you have Western modernist cultures arriving at various places from the Renaissance onward with missions of piracy, I suppose, occupation, plunder, but also covered up by a mission of civilizing and Christianizing. Saying it's our mission, say the British, to civilize the world. That's why they invented concentration camps for your great-grandparents. Or some other nation, the Spanish, will say we need to spread the Christian faith and save these heathens from eternal damnation. So you have a number of worthy projects, and then you have a number of worthy heathens who buy into these projects. Because after all, if you're in a colonial situation and all of the advanced positions reside within the colonial gang, you might think you have the talent to join the colonial gang. And so we have the race to become Coconut or Uncle Tom or whatever you want to say, derogative term. But somebody who assimilates themselves, goes to the Sorbonne, gets a PhD, etc., 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 and speaks good French and wears a necktie and so on. Right? But is never really accepted in the colonial gang. Because how can they assert themselves in the colonial gang by referencing themselves? They can only assert themselves in the colonial conversation by referencing the acquired colonial identity. Yeah? Now, what do? Sartre had an interesting suggestion. In his preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, he suggests an exorcism of the colonial power, of the colonial identity. You shoot the colonial, and it has a double advantage. One dead man and one free man. So at that point, you almost create a sacrificial, releasing of this colonial identity. And you stop managing a divided identity, a damaging divided identity, where you are seen as inferior, where your body, your pigment, your language, your attitude, beliefs, feelings, everything is seen as in somehow outside of the center in which one can neutrally and meaningly assert something reasonable. But of course, if you blow up the colonial situation, you have to invent something to take its place. And you have to invent in such a way that you don't merely cause it to return. It's very interesting to look at the revolution in Haiti. Hegel writes about it in 1806 and becomes very influential for his own thinking about how servitude and recognition hang together. But that is another story. Throughout the history of black nationalism in America and in South Africa, and the two movements intermodulate very strongly at the turn of the last century. Many South Africans, Pixley Seme and others are in America, absorbing these discussions of a black nationalism, which then translates into the African National Congress, there is this sense that you have to make your way in the modern world. But to make your way in the modern world, you have to change yourself, and you have to have a particular identity that can function in the modern world. But then on the other hand, you have to maintain and assert or take care of your own identity. But it cannot find direct expression in the modern world because it's seen as inferior, irrational, second-rate, dumb, crazy, meaningless. Exactly the way women's experience in America in 1980 and 89 is portrayed when Rorty picks it up. So not only women, but all oppressed people find themselves oppressed in the same way. Not oppressed by having a gun put to your head or being whipped or chained up or working for nothing or whatever, although those are of course parts of it, but oppressed in a more subtle way by being subject to Western identity, but not allowed to be part of it. And having no space within Western identity to assert your identity as yours. Therefore being forced to assert your Western identity, which you keep like a pet, for all Western purposes, and then perhaps on Sunday, getting a bit of equalization. And in the Springs article, the second article, there is a very interesting discussion of American slave religion and how Christianity is ambiguously modulated in the American black experience. As something which on the one hand, religion was denied slaves for 100 years in the United States, but then it was believed that through religion slaves could be taught about their proper position as the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, and St. Paul said slaves should obey their masters, and a whole lot of very oppressive jazz that the slave owners found conveniently proposed as part of this setup. And then of course the thing started to turn around when it became clear through Christianity that the masters too had a master somewhere in the sky. And therefore, if we can have a direct relation to the master's master, the master is not all-encompassing. The master is in the same boat as us. So there is this strange modulation, if you like, of Christian themes initially thrown in to the mix as a tool of further oppression or brainwashing or exclusion. And then these things are turned around and turned into an instrument to support egalitarian claims, become a source of powerful underground metaphors, become the source of blues music, become the source of jazz music. All these blues situations that you hear about in this extraordinary music are in a way referencing biblical characters and their situations, and it gets turned around. So as opposed to rebellion, where you cut a couple of throats and whatever, light up a couple of grape plantations today. Rebellion's easily put down, as we've seen with Marikana, but if you take, in fact, one of the major discourses of your oppressor, and you start to slowly chisel away at its norms, and you find some leeway in these norms in such a way that you can use it against the owners of that discourse, such that they find themselves very confused. Just as white America finds itself very confused in the face of black American religiosity today, whether it is the religiosity of Pastor Malcolm X or the religiosity of Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton. It has become a prickly pear, which the oppressor cannot exactly throw away or distance themselves from without becoming very inconsistent. After all, America is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It is a nominally Christian country, even though not constitutionally. But if somebody had to suggest, setting up a Christian theocracy in the White House, they'd get a lot of supporters. So it is a prevalent part of American mainstream culture. But at the same time, it's been appropriated and molded and made into something rather uncomfortable and edgy by black America. So that is interestingly discussed under the notion that you cannot criticize your oppressor using the tools of your oppressor's thought, and this wants to argue otherwise Springs wants to argue otherwise and say that, in fact, within anybody's thought, your oppressor, anybody, it has certain norms, and you can seize these norms, alter them, turn them around, introduce a metaphorical value into a literal one, and vice versa. And, in fact, create mayhem in the master's house, using precisely the master's tools to demolish it. So the idea that criticism or radical criticism of something has to come from outside is challenged in the second article. Now, Rorty does not quite agree, and let's jump back to our case study of the other oppression, the oppression of women, which continues, by the way, and is far less obvious than the oppression of, say, minorities or colonized people, or the oppression that arises through this kind of happy, rational ethnocentricity is exactly the same oppression that excludes women. Now, Rorty's remedy or his suggestion is that women too find themselves managing divided identities. Men, don't look so glum. There's something for you coming up later on. You're not going to get dragged out and kicked and beaten at some point in this discussion. But these are two very striking frameworks, and they are in fact fantastic, compelling reasons why we should be pragmatic, why pragmatism is an exceptional strategy. Women are managing divided identities. Rorty cites Adrienne Rich, who's a pioneer feminist writer and poet and so on, who says that she finds herself, or she could assert herself sometime in the 1960s, through writing poetry. But at the same time, she could not quite get over the issue of her relationship to men, such that she didn't know whether she was incomplete or strange or odd or whatever. She was still in a way defining herself through this issue of single or not single. It was still impacting her. On the other hand, herself, the self she wanted to be and wanted to assert, was the poet, the writer and poet. This was her vocation. And she writes about Emily Dickinson, a great American poet, who was always regarded as either crazy or eccentric, but perhaps one of the finest American poets. And Dickinson, of course, was always single in this problematic relation. And in a way, because she was single, the fact that she was this single woman overshadowed her importance, her activity in society as a creative writer, as a very great poet. Right on a par with the other great poets at the time, like Walt Whitman, who was dealing with a similar problem because, as you know, Whitman was gay. Not a nice thing to be in American society at that time. Black, gay, female. And wanting to assert yourself in a framework where you cannot assert yourself or be a member by referencing yourself. And what could be more solidly referencing yourself than writing poetry? You write poetry from yourself. You make a self in poetry. But what if that poetry self can never become public? It has to become public through the genre of androcentric type. You've heard of the great writer, novelist George Eliot, who was female. George Sand, another great French writer, female. Only into the 20th century with Virginia Woolf do you get women having an authority in fiction, not having to create a pseudonym for themselves by using male names. And even though in architecture, there are more women in architecture than men, according to the stats, but women in architecture still have a very hard time because they have to learn to mix it up with the engineers in the engineers' terms. Very few women have asserted themselves in architecture as women. We haven't heard from women in architecture. We've heard from our brilliant equals, and in some cases betters, but along the same ladder of achievement and along the same type of identity and career path laid down by men. So how are we going to transform architecture and make it open to people who've undergone the experience of colonial captivity and damage, when in fact women in architecture are still little guys. You will agree with this. How do you reference yourself in architecture as a woman? It's perfectly incidental that you're a woman in architecture. Gender is just a tick box. You're a good architect, or you're a lousy architect, or you're up to date with the postmodern XYZ, or you're a such and such. None of that references you focally as woman. So you're still managing a divided identity. You're managing his identity that you've had to borrow, the mask, and mine and his. And you are managing your own aspirations, which are the aspirations of women. So how are we going to transform architecture if we cannot, in fact, acknowledge or recognize women within architecture? And if women don't feel confident to reference themselves in architecture through their own ways of thinking, their own sensibility, without feeling they're going to slip down the ladder or have it used against them, then how on earth are we going to have transformation and reference and have Black South Africa feel confident to reference itself in architecture and not have to speak through the ventriloquist mask of the colonial architecture, which even colonizes itself now with Balinese styles. So colonizing, all it knows how to do, it's become a kind of meta-colonization with this Tuscan and Balinese fad. Anyway, Rorty's suggestion is very interesting. He says, where do poets come from? Goethe, Byron, Shelley were all a bunch of young men who said they could defy their teachers, their parents, their society, their age, their time by being poets. And being a poet in the Romantic era was an honorable thing to be. It was an amazing, fantastic, bling thing to be. It was like being Iggy Pop or Frank Zappa. You know, who would want to turn that down when you could absolutely disrupt, annoy, put out a joint, write your own ticket, and manifest yourself strongly in this creative space? And of course, the vocation of poet and writer was established by this group of men, and they consciously shaped themselves into culture heroes. The way Socrates shaped himself into an extraordinary philosopher and a hero for Greek society. So they shaped themselves, and in shaping themselves as a group, they constantly corresponded with each other and referenced one another and supported one another and got into sort of incredible hijinks, where that was Hodelan going crazy and then writing these letters from the middle of craziness and nobody being able to ignore his craziness because his poetry was so good. Or whether it was Lord Byron going off to fight a war to liberate the Greeks from the Turks, only to find that the Greeks were so much like the Turks that he had to keep imagining these ancient Greeks or whatever. But it turned him into a kind of big, like Matt Damon type of character. He could go back to England and he could say, oh, Hemingway, I was like in the war. The vocation of writer, poet, and hero was formed by these men. It was easier for these men to form it. But for women who wanted to take on the identity of poet, they had to, like George Eliot or Emily Dickinson, manage a divided identity. Their poet existence became a private and personal one. Their best poetry is found in the diary, in the tin trunk under the bed after they died. But their life was the life of simply an eccentric, or a masculinized woman, or whatever. So how does one bring these two things together? And of course, Rorty, and I think you've obviously figured this out yourselves, Rorty is saying that the problem arises of having to manage a double identity because you are being called upon to assert yourself within that sphere. In that sphere, you have one role: wife, mother, sister, girlfriend, etc. But outside that sphere, within the middle of this privacy here, just as we have religious relation within the privacy within the Black American experience, inside this situation, you have your aspirations as a writer, etc. And when you are a writer, in your room, you are referencing yourself. But when you try and transact yourself as a writer in this situation, you are a second-class citizen. Now, Rorty's suggestion is very interesting because he says women, in his case, he's talking about women, feminism, as a strategy against oppression, an insidious, not obvious kind of oppression, an oppression that is simply normal Western reason and normal Western factual identity. He says that women should embrace separatism. They should behave the way the poets did, only corresponding with one another and seeing the rest of the society as them, as the non-elect, as the benighted. Or they should embrace separatism the way in which Galilean scientists embraced a particular separatism and wrote to one another, created a kind of evidence and communication and thought which only the other scientists of the time understood. If you look at the minutes of the Royal Societies and the kind of communication in the 17th century between scientists, it is almost coded. It is almost a secret society. There are these underground Copernicans, and indeed many of these individuals had to be underground figures because the church regarded a great deal of science as heresy. But once that situation was overcome and there was détente with the church, and it was clear that scientific knowledge with Newton and a royal patronage of the Royal Academy and so on, Royal Academy of Sciences, once it became clear that it was a mainstream part of society, it still remained esoteric. And to this day, science remains esoteric. It remains a consensus of suitably accredited people. And to be a suitably accredited scientist and have a relevant opinion in a science, you have to go through a rigorous training, almost like a Buddhist monk, almost a theological level of training to be an accredited scientist. It's almost like being an accredited architect. And who are the other groups? Who pull themselves apart from society and do what? Develop a language that focally references themselves and their central activity. In other words, Galilean scientists are a minority. Modern scientists are a minority in the 17th century. But they only do and communicate and assert themselves to the group and in the group in order to form a common language in which they are focally referenced. This is what Galileo said, this is what Descartes said, this is what Huygens said, etc. And in that world, they have an authority. They recognize each other and give one another an authority. And eventually the broader world, for whom they are just marginal eccentrics, the broader world has need of what they've developed. And suddenly it's not so bad if your son and daughter wants to become a scientist, or your son and daughter wants to become a poet. Now we're in a situation, what if my son or daughter wants to be gay? How happy are you about this? Or do you go to bed every night and say, thank God I'm not black, I'm not woman, I'm not gay, I'm not colonized, etc.? That is the default assumption. But once that becomes a total non-issue, and you say, it's a perfectly plausible human future to be anything. After all, we have not begun to explore the varieties of possible human practices. We have no idea what humans can be. We have no idea what our feelings, our bodies, our thoughts, our expressions, our experience could be. We simply need to create the practices around it, give those practices their own norms and their own coherence, initially perhaps in a kind of separatism, where they're not always having to deal with or feel encroached on by otherwise thinking people. But if the separatism establishes a strong enough norm within itself and references its members as they speak as themselves in that little secret society, it ceases to be a secret society. It becomes the new public. And that, for pragmatism, is the way change happens. And all change happens. Change does not happen by criticizing the conceptual framework or providing ourselves with new objects or experiences within that conceptual framework. It changes by creating new coalitions around different norms. But it won't help if I just distribute different norms among you like a fortune cookie. Because that'll just be a game, intellectual game which you play, like when you are designing something postmodern and then it takes your fancy to do something retro and conservation oriented, and then you feel like being neo-modern, and then next week you want to be Damien Hirst. That is a complete waste of time. Those are not norms. For a norm to be a norm, you must be enabled to use it in such a way that every time you use it, you are focally referencing it yourself. You're using it as yourself. You're going to be using it as half black, half woman, half Chinese, half non-Western, half child, whatever. All of these people who are in a way condescended to by the neutrality of the mainstream. You must use it in a way that completely references yourself. And if we go back to some of our early examples, if we look at the three massive solitaries who define artistic modernity in the West, if we look at Cezanne, who was a terrible painter when he was young. Well, in fact, he was a terrible painter for most of his life. If you look at catalogues, early Cezanne, you say, yay, more Cezannes. But you come away bitterly disappointed because they're like terrible courbets that have been smeared with, covered in Marmite and attacked with a palette knife, and everything sarcastic that critics were saying about Cezanne, I think, was richly deserved up to that point. And only when Cezanne is in his 50s does he accede to his faults and stop trying desperately to overcome them. And he starts painting from the position of his faults. And he endorses his faults and becomes Cezanne on the basis of that, through accession to his limitations. And thereafter, he wanders around, he fights with his wife, his in-laws, everybody else. He wanders around in a semi-diabetic state, trying to capture something, what he calls his little sensation, and often just abandoning these canvases wherever he happens to be, or in exchange for a night at an inn or whatever. So throughout the 1930s, people would go through the south of France and just gather up these incredible half-finished Cezannes from people who just didn't know what to do with them. But he becomes himself in this very solitary situation. And Merleau-Ponty writes a very beautiful essay about Cezanne's doubt, and how Cezanne is constantly confronting doubt, his perceptual doubt, by trying to be there strongly in that landscape and reference himself in it. And it keeps slipping, and it keeps falling past him, and he is driven by this doubt. But in any event, a solitary. Van Gogh, solitary to the point of incommunicability. The only person he communicates with is his brother. And he kills his brother in the process, bankrupts him, does him in, ruins his marriage, etc., etc. But the brother basically keeps that minimal element of kind of sociability alive for Vincent van Gogh. But Van Gogh, extremely solitary individual. Gauguin, utterly solitary, in fact, takes himself into a realm where his Western experience has little or no meaning, and then tries to reconstitute himself in a society completely different to his own. So it's interesting that three absolute solitaries had to become almost one-person worlds in order to be able to reference themselves in the painting of the time. And in doing that, they opened the opportunity for Matisse, for Kandinsky, for Picasso, and so on and so forth. Even Picasso felt that he had to take stringent steps to overcome his solitariness. He worked side by side with Georges Braque while developing Cubism. And then Braque went on to a career of great mediocrity that was rescued, sort of like Iggy Pop's career, at the 11th hour by becoming the great old man, but basically he hadn't changed since 1915. Picasso went on to sort of embrace every conceivable non-Western tradition, and then start to go back to the Western traditions and tear a strip right off the museum with these variations on Manet and Velázquez and Rembrandt and so on. But either way, quite a solitary activity, but almost in a way suggesting another kind of society, another kind of solidarity, another kind of sensibility that could be brought about, another kind of community that could be brought about by those pictures. Anton Webern said one day the waiters in Vienna will go around whistling his music. It hasn't happened yet. But there was this persistent dream that in some sense there is a virtual community around art. And I'm saying that why? Because the artists at tremendous cost managed or had to reference themselves. They paint from the position of the spectator, and a painter stands in the spectator's position. So it's very easy for them to kind of imagine a spectator and then step forward and paint, step back, become the spectator, step forward and paint. They're the only art that is created from the position of the spectator. So painting can create this idea of a kind of virtual internal community while the painter references themselves. Now back to women. It is Rorty's suggestion that women, that feminists, separate themselves and develop and flirt with a discourse or activity or concepts or norms that seem openly meaningless. But take that meaningless, what would previously have been called mad or eccentric or crazy. The oppressor always makes you feel crazy if you try and dissent. Oppression is set up in such a way that dissent makes you feel crazy for dissenting. Take that crazy discourse into its own home, into its own circle, validate it, use it as an experimental means to take yourself further away from the discourse of the oppressor, establish that discourse with its own norms, produce striking results the way a Cézanne or a Van Gogh or a Gauguin did, such that the rest of society cannot ignore it. That is Rorty's advice. And he's saying that pragmatism is an important philosophy for not only the oppressed, which is the vast majority of humans on this planet, if we're talking about women, but for the society to change itself. It cannot change itself by critique. It cannot change itself by looking deeply into its concepts and revising these concepts and saying, how can I get better concepts? How can I reform what is in my head? Or how can I find other realities? It cannot change itself by analysis. It cannot change itself by sincere self-examination. It can only change itself by imagining an alternative, because until an alternative is imagined and the alternative is perceived as crazy or meaningless, it's impossible to see the oppressive norm that we've all been using and endorsing. We are not oppressors in the present. We are oppressors in retrospect. It could be that what I'm saying here is in some cryptic sense oppressive. But I have no way of knowing it. I can only make it as clear or be as responsible for what I say or stand behind what I say and be prepared to elucidate it or clarify it as best I can. But I cannot know if it has oppressive consequences. But assuming one of you comes up with a counter discourse, saying all the things I'm unable to say or even unable to imagine, and you're courageous enough to imagine another world, another future, another practice entirely or way of deploying yourself, then it may well be that in contrast to that imaginative construction, the limitations of what I am saying here become apparent. Let me try and give you an analogy to this. You all have access to DSTV. You all watch these reruns. James Bond, Jurassic Park. When you saw Jurassic Park, you thought that dinosaur walking across the screen was the most breathtaking, realistic thing you've ever seen. Now, 20 years later almost, 20 years of special effects, you look at that thing and you say, very phony. I can see a white line flickering along its back, and this, that, and the other. When you first saw Sean Connery as James Bond, you thought coolest dude in the world. Now you think chauvinistic British Burke. You know, how come he didn't get slapped by all these women? They must be absolute bimbos, you know. And how could the British ever have been so big-headed as to think that they were a world superpower and should be meddling in these things, and the CIA is wringing their hands to help them, whatever. You look at these things and you say, wow, but why? We would have never seen these things as dated or in some sense limited if we had not had other kinds of more subtle or ironic views of spies, agents, whatever it is. And the whole spy-agent thing has become completely campy. It's become a semi-comedy genre with this Scientology guy, what's his name? Mission Impossible. The little guy. Tom. There's the good Tom Hanks and there's the bad Tom Cat. And The same is true of special effects. What seemed like a killer special effect now seems very dated. When you have kids and you say to your kids, such and such a movie is on TV, you've got to watch it. That was the greatest movie I ever saw. And you're sitting there and you're dying of embarrassment because it's absolutely hokey, unsophisticated. You say, what did my mother and father see in Casablanca? I mean, it is not because those things have somehow critiqued themselves, or not because those things were not somehow sincere efforts. They seem limiting. It seems very limiting to be James Bond, Sean Connery James Bond now, in the desperate attempts to upgrade and PC James Bond with Daniel Craig, who seems to be a very monotonous fellow and was at his best as a cowboy shooting chochas, what do you call these things? Aliens. It's not that the original James Bond was some kind of macho conspiracy. It's just that because there have been alternatives put into our experience, imagined and put out there, it's possible for us to judge it as a kind of sexual dinosaur, as a kind of macho simplicity or naivety, etc. Yeah. Shake and not stir. What is the time, guys? The break is coming earlier than usual. Do you think it's the weather? Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break. So the picture which we left to go and smoke with was of the usual pivots of change in Western thought having become fairly meaningless, having dissolved before our eyes. The idea that we develop our concepts by reflecting accurately something which is outside ourselves. The idea that our reason is in some sense a reality tracking device, that it can somehow know how to lock onto moral realities or aesthetic value or objective truth, etc., has to be abandoned. The very idea of a mind as somehow as the access point, the privileged access point to reality, has to be abandoned. The mind may well be one element, one link in a chain, one mediation among others in establishing experience, reality, fact, the kinds of things we like to use and assert and transact when we talk about knowledge or value or justice or freedom or identity or whatever. And certainly there is no bag of concepts, no pick and pay super warehouse where we can go around in language and pull suitable concepts out and then polish them like apples by refining them through logic, etc., and then applying them like laser searchlights back to reality and making the refinements we want. So there's no leverage in language and mind, and there's no leverage in reality, and the relationship between the two is rather odd. Why? It's an odd Western prejudice. Should we think of our experience as a gateway through which reality, the universe, etc. must pass and then get packaged into knowledge? It's a very peculiar notion indeed. And if we follow Taylor and Rorty, a very ethnocentric notion. It characterizes the recent history of the West's sort of self-picture, how it would like to see itself. It's an idealization. What do we have left in its place? We have left human communities where we manage our way in and through that community, where we use that community's ability to recognize and to receive recognition from us in turn, and where we somehow get by together using language, using our feelings, using our perceptions, using our concepts, using our emotions, using our hopes and aspirations, even using our fears, to inform some kind of shared practice, such that what I am doing is intelligible to you because you believe it's part of the shared practice of theorizing, philosophizing, criticism, critiquing, etc. that goes on in the West today, such as what you are doing makes sense to your friends and your enemies alike, because it has a certain coherence as a practice. It's something you do. Now, if practices, loose kinds of, if you think of a practice as not some kind of chain or cable linking one type of reality to another, but if you think of it as a rope is made of short strands, but the strands overlap sufficiently to give it strength and coherence. So even though you might say, this strand means that, but this strand is just part of the picture. That strand means that. You might be able to talk about individual strands, but they in fact overlap, but the rope is never made up of one single strand. There is no single strand going through here called the world or reality. There's no single strand here called the mind. What keeps this rope together is the various overlaps that we manage when we make ourselves understood and we help others to be understood by us. And what have we got? What instrument do we have for doing that? Well, we have ourselves as a resource, we have language as a resource, but we have the ability to paraphrase. If you say, I don't understand what obsequious means, you'll say, obsequious is like brown-nosing. I don't understand what brown-nosing means. Well, it's somebody who habitually is kissing up to their superiors and perhaps kicking down on the heads of their inferiors. That's an obsequious person. Ah, you say, because I know sort of one of those strands. I know a couple of brown noses, a few miserable goody two-shoe bureaucrats, etc. A couple of suck-up kind of individuals always puckering up to their bosses and looking for favors and backbiting their colleagues. Therefore, I know obsequious. Okay, so what have I done? I've made something implicit in the connection of brown nose, pucker up, etc. I've made something explicit. I've extracted, I've made a space for another notion or experience or connotation or something to slip in there. So in other words, I can explicate. We can explicate. You can explicate. You can explicate through an analogy, through historical parallel. You can say, I'm doing what Napoleon did in 1810. It doesn't matter what you use to explicate. When you explicate, you're adding a strand or you're pulling out a strand and you're giving some kind of parallel or some kind of further definition to that strand, and the strand goes back into the rope. And this rope is our set of practices. And in these practices, there are certain norms. If you do something in a certain way, because others do it the same way, they can make sense of your behavior, they can make sense of what you want, of what you intend, etc. And if we have a self, myself is not some spook residing inside my body that I can extract on the judgment day and finally shake hands with. Myself is something which I use in a variety of roles. I can use myself the way I use a promissory note. If I need to borrow money and I say, take my phone as a guarantee and I'll give you the money tomorrow. This is myself. I can use myself as a warrant, as a promissory note. I can say, I promise you, or I intend to do this, or I assure you I will do X. And then, of course, if I don't do it, I've lost some strand from myself. Myself is no longer seen as having trustworthiness or reliability or whatever. Or I could add reliability to myself by making some kind of public warrant with myself and doubling my efforts to come through in spite of the odds. And I'll say, so-and-so is an absolute brick, you can rely on them. So I'm constantly building and rebuilding myself around norms. So that's not quite the self, Casper the Friendly Ghost that we are used to from Western philosophy, as this ghost in a kind of knowing machine linked to some kind of reality, constantly representing it and creating better and better models within those representations, and so on. So in the pragmatic situation, we are constantly remodeling the rope. Or if you like another metaphor, we are constantly rebuilding the ship while we are at sea. It's possible to rebuild the ship and never go back into harbor. When this piece breaks, you change that piece. When that piece breaks, you change that piece. Eventually, you've rebuilt the whole ship, but it's a very different ship because you put improvements into each strand. But if you try to rebuild the whole ship at sea, of course, you'll sink. So this idea of a kind of management of practices around norms, and norms are negotiated points of agreement. And they might lapse. They might become previous or irrelevant or meaningless or pointless agreements at some time in the future. So that is the conception that pragmatism has of how we manage reality, our relation to it, our relation to one another, by constantly and innovatively and rather theatrically explicating the norms, making the norms clearer. Now, of course, when we speak a language, our language has rules, it has meanings captured in a dictionary, it has the structure captured in grammar and logic and so on. But we can always use language to explicate language, as in the case of obsequious. And we can use behavior to explicate behavior, as in acts of heroism or acts of honor, or acts of great cunning and so on. So we have a much looser situation. And we have a demand, or rather we have a suggestion, that society, reality, experience is not just going on behind our backs like a movie projector and a screen, and we're somewhere in the middle taking it all in. If we get rid of that metaphor, the mirror metaphor, and we say that we are called upon to constantly renew this strand, we are some part of that strand, we have to constantly stand up and be counted in one or another respect, through loyalty and friendship, through truthfulness, through being doubtful, questioning of something when you think it's not right, through sincerity, through authenticity, through truth to yourself, through hiddenness and veiledness sometimes, that's what it takes. If we have to constantly manage this strand, we are in effect managing experience, reality, our world and ourself at the same time. So the kinds of tools that are required to do this are very different to the tools of sitting in a kind of cosmic cinema, watching consciousness, kind of push representations around on a screen and then making up our minds and having a good scratch about how we're going to participate. We are thrown into the situation willy-nilly. We cannot extricate ourselves from the situation. In fact, for Rorty, the idea of a mirror of nature, etc., is an almost a kind of utopia that we can extricate ourselves from the various storms and entanglements and confrontations that make up practice. The question is, who speaks with this practice or that practice? And how can an emerging practice become as big or more authoritative or more legitimate, etc., than one already established? Tonight we dealt with the issue of how what looks like a neutral, Western, rational, just, objective, factual consensus practice is in fact highly excluding of maybe most people. And it turns out once those people who have been excluded assert a practice on their own terms, that this Western universal rationality in both concept and in practice, its strongest practice being colonial, but also, say, a society like the United States, liberal democratic society is one of its very strong expressions, that this practice turns out to be perfectly ethnocentric. It serves a handful of people. Now, if they are being served by it, how do we get some of that action? If we enter into their way of doing things, they control the terrain. But we have to take the long road and weave a strand of our own and put that strand alongside theirs, maintain our separatism, and then people can say there are two ways of doing it. Or in the light of the new strand, this seems very odd and dated. And that's exactly what has happened. If we look at the three thinkers we've dealt with so far, if we look at Habermas, He's basically saying that there is a crisis of continuity in Western reason, in the project of the Western Enlightenment. We don't know what the bearers are. And if we break it down to the scientific, the aesthetic, and the political bearers, these bearers don't seem to communicate with each other. They all seem to have developed their own rather parochial rationality. And that the only continuity we have is the Lebenswelt, common sense. But common sense doesn't really pass muster for certain social demands. How do we deal with the economic crisis of the fiscal cliff in common sense? Because the fiscal cliff didn't arise in common sense. Or how do we deal with global warming in common sense? Because common sense has no grasp of it. Common sense never saw it coming. So we have a very divided picture of reasoning, a very devalued sense of Western rationality, split across various partial, each one inadequate bases. In Taylor, we see a situation where there's no foundation, where it's interpretation all the way down, where human beings are beings for whom being themselves is constantly in question and will be in question until the end of time, and who constantly have to dig and interpret and try and find frameworks and backgrounds to keep making their norms and their own behavior and their such and such intelligible. In Rorty, we've seen that those backgrounds are practices, and that those practices shift and new practices come along, and that it's not a matter of reforming that practice nicely from within, as in South Africa with a constitution and a extended franchise and a liberal democracy, etc., Helenzilla utopia. It is not a matter of reforming it from within. It's as reformed from within as it possibly can be. In fact, we have a very perfect liberal democratic society here, but it doesn't work. Someone will say, let's bring back the dictators. Someone else will say, let's become our own dictators and go socialist and create a big welfare state with a few bosses. Somebody else will say, we need to articulate South African practices, and that this is in fact Western liberal democratic framework. This is a hangover of Western colonial modernist thinking. But we think it's neutral. Why do we think it's neutral? Rorty gives us the answer. Until you have built an alternative practice, until you've made more sophisticated special effects than Jurassic Park, Jurassic Park's going to look like it, peachy, the ultimate in special effects. Now we look at it and say, creaky. Okay? But it wasn't creaky. It became creaky as a result of other things which came alongside it. Sean Connery became ludicrous, not suave, because other kinds of adventure, espionage, etc., and the Cold War disappeared. We have a very different pluralistic world compared to the two sides in the Third World, fought over heart and mind, fought over in the middle. So some other practices have crept up with a radioactive glow that makes our existing practices seem dated. And because our existing Western practices, our liberal democratic, rational, fact-based, objective, person-centric, right-centric, whatever you want to call it, framework, believes itself to be in perfect equilibrium. It believes itself to possess all the ingredients that it needs for a perfect society. The DA says we just need to implement them through better management technique, and we're all happy because it believes itself complete, and it can validate its completeness against this big thing called nature and this big thing called experience and history and whatever, and it can have justice and it can juggle this bit and bring that bit and fine-tune. It is incapable of further evolution. It cannot match the innovations that crop up around it. It believes it's arrived at the end of history. And in fact, there's a very influential book by a very interesting neoconservative thinker called Francis Fukuyama in the 90s, one of those American State Department type boffins, Cold War think tank type guys. Nice job for me one day to devise the next Cold War. Fukuyama writes a book called The End of History, where he says that once the liberal democratic consensus is established on a worldwide scale, this is the Clinton era, this is the 1990s, There is no further world system that can emerge and challenge it. In other words, this is liberal, democratic, Western, modernist thinking died and gone to heaven because it's globalized. There can be nothing bigger than that. But what he fails to see is that it is in fact just one practice among many. He fails to see how absolutely ethnocentric, neutral, rational, objective, Western, liberal, democratic, justice-driven, institutionalized reason, critique-driven thinking is. It's in fact the expression of a few North Atlantic wasps. But that wouldn't be clear until other powerful forms of thinking popped up on the same turf. It's not that, globalization is not cool anymore because China's doing it to us. Globalization was wonderful. It was the spread of liberal, democratic, peaceful democracy to the world when America was globalizing us. But now the BRICS countries are pushing back. Globalization's a menace because it's telling you that other practices, not partaking of this liberal democratic one, have caught up with it and are surrounding it. When the Chinese send a rocket into space, they don't send it into space in English. And you must understand that Fukuyama's image of an end of history is in a way a commencement of a very competitive history in which different ropes and different strands now, in their separatism, having completed themselves, having become quite powerful in their separatism, now converge on territories where they formerly could only go by managing a divided identity. So that goes for women, that goes for colonized people, that goes for anybody who feels they are managing stigma or potential stigma as they go around in this world. A world defined by what? If a world were rational, democratic, liberal, just, etc., stigma would be impossible. But we're in a society that almost runs on stigmatization and scapegoating. So consider how the stigmatized fight back. The stigmatized must turn the stigma into a new norm. Being a woman, I want to hear from women as women in the Supreme Court. Women were previously half beings. They were treated like defective, mentally defective children. They were treated by, in spite of yourself, you can be a judge. In spite of yourself, you can be an executive. In spite of yourself, you can be a general, etc. Being a woman is like being sick. Being black is like being sick. Being gay is like being sick. You are treated by this as sick. You are a semi-capacity. You are a half white male. But we're so generous that we're going to let you kind of come in here and squawk, providing you do it according to our rules. But once you seize the norm, and once your norm is bigger than their norm, well then, you're going to soon find that you dominate the scene, and some other strange minority is going to come up, maybe aggrieved men, in the sort of fourth or fifth generation. You're going to try and fight back and what have you. Now, something for the poor men in this room who don't fit the profile of formerly colonized gay, but just are hanging in there as best they can with all these sinister practices and norms creeping up on you, such that you can't see them until, suddenly you're Jurassic Park. I mentioned last time something that is quite close to my concerns, and I know to Chat's as well in our conversations, and that is the question of indigenization. And when one talks about indigenization in this liberal democratic framework, in this Helen Ziller world, it simply means a bit of Afro-bongo. It means that you put some little zigzags on your serviette, or you wear some sort of lucky charm, or you learn 3 words of Swahili and try and bargain in some Cape Town flea market with them, and so on. And so some friend of my friend of my friend, or whatever, has friends who are black. Now, but indigenization simply means taking over norms which you were previously subject to from the outside and making them norms which you now control or take on from the inside. And these norms might initially be like hot potatoes. The one who gets it has to eat it. These norms might be very difficult. It's not just, oh, we're going to kick off the West and the androcentric world, we're going to sit back for the weekend, smoke a reefer, and we're going to dream up some norms. It's a matter of taking over the function of a norm that was previously oppressive, that came to you from outside, from beyond your control, and reshaping or reinventing that norm, and often reinventing yourself around that norm in such a way that you control it, such that it becomes yours. Now, this situation of indigenization, of bringing the norms out of this practice and into this one, and reshaping both the practice and the norm, and not letting this practice be suddenly magnetized and pulled back into the one that you are trying to distance yourself from. This is an unfinished project in large parts of white South Africa. And I've said on many occasions, and I said at the University of Stellenbosch once, in very august company, I had Crane Sudine sitting on the one side and Federico Settler sitting on the other, and all these Black Consciousness Archive guys and people who shaped the transformation policy and whatever. And there were the Stellenbosch guys who were my hosts. And I said to them, you really need to stop walking around close to the wall with your collars up and being ironic and being bit players in bitter comics. You need to forget this irony thing. You're all Nathaniel kind of thing, and harmless and whatever. Sorry, Nathaniel. Sorry, Nathaniel. You're a player in your own right. But you simply have to recognize that the Afrikaner institutions set about a deliberate process of anti-colonial and decolonial, and try to imagine a post-colonial utopia. And not only sat around and imagined this, but set up their own institutions with their own norms around a particular language, for poetry, for literature, for music, for the consolidation of traditions, for particular kind of theology, for particular kind of law, for particular kind of education, eventually for particular kind of political power. So you have an extraordinary project, a very early anti-colonial genius, if you like. First of all, you invent guerrilla warfare and terrorism against the British. 10 out of 10. They well deserved. You know, ask the Indians what the British should get. And then secondly, you invent a republican ideal of creating your own practice and your own institutions, without the norms of Oxford and Cambridge, etc., to the universities. But the universities try and focus themselves on the existing situation and play some role in defining and enhancing the situation and asserting themselves in the situation. Now, how things panned out in the 20th century, partly as a result of continued British efforts at oppression, the British failure to recognize autonomy, or the Boer failure to assert autonomy in a way that could be recognized, in a way similar to the Indian assertion of autonomy against the British and so on. Partly because of that, and partly because of the modulation of world politics by the Cold War, this process of indigenization turned out to have some bad consequences, very bad consequences. But in the process, it highlighted the problems and the challenges of any practice-based norm creating or recreating, courage and imagination-based process of self-assertion. There is a danger that that self-assertion becomes resolutely ethnocentric. It becomes about the people who do it for the people who do it. And we've seen with feminism that feminism, to some degree, especially in extreme feminism, remains quite exclusionary and can focus entirely on the rights and benefits of the individuals on the inside. It's not there to universalize its gains. It's there in order to assert itself in a picture and against something. But if it asserted itself so powerfully, it could easily become the only game in town. It could be oppressive, and we could be sitting here as men, very unhappy that we are now in a gynocentric regime which makes Ayatollah Khomeini look like tiddlywinks. We're having like not fluoride in the water, but that kind of chemical castration drug and whatever, and we don't know it, and we're boiling the water over primus stoves in some secret cellar somewhere and drinking only imported beer and so on. Now, so there is that possibility. So I'm saying that just as one can undermine one's assertion by trying to do it in the terms of the master and with the master's tools, believing in justice and that you can just rearrange things into fairness and equality and whatever within the dominant regime. So you can overmine, if you like, the situation and create an exclusivist, highly ethnocentric or highly group-centric vision, which I think in South Africa was a consequence of having to fight colonialism without the normal, obvious allies for fighting colonialism at your side. And having to fight colonialism under very abnormal pressures where colonialism fought back. The British fought back in a big way. And the world consensus seemed to stand against the South African Republic and whatever. And it did itself no favors by taking on this kind of inward-looking objective while at the same time trying to achieve its goals. Now, it so happens that the greatest boost to this process of indigenization, of bringing norms into South African society away from the colonial centers where they were developed, administered, created, tuned, took on a significant step in a kind of deliberate modernization of the 1961 Republic, as I mentioned last time. And that process was phenomenally successful, but was heavily colored and modulated by our old friend, the Western consensus, by the so-called free world influence during the Cold War. So in other words, it became a republicanism in name, or a modernization in name, but very much in the service of Washington and the Pentagon. And how I know that, I'll tell you one day. But if you wanted to avoid being killed in those days, you had to avoid the CIA and Israelis. So the Republican ideal has in fact become the benchmark of neutral, liberal democratic, Helen Zilleville, Constitution, Mail and Guardian type South Africa. In other words, the kind of South Africa as imagined by the civilized descendants of British colonists. It's become the default instrument. And that Republican model after 94 became the instrument for having a better constitution, a universal franchise, a wider defense of rights, attempt to define opportunities for all, etc., etc. But all that happened was that the Republican model got hijacked by the Western model, and the indigenization process stopped in its tracks. And when one says indigenization today, one doesn't think University of Pretoria, University of Stellenbosch, University of Bloemfontein, academy, the strong academies, the strong professions, the strong whatever, that launched their rocket in Afrikaans. One thinks indigenization, Patekile Holomisa, and some guy making a strong claim for tribal authority. But in fact, the mainstream indigenization process, which is the necessary step in any decolonization, that is to bring the norms within the deliberation and within the control and within the inventiveness of the people in the country, and not to allow Western, rational, neutral, so-called Western ethnocentrism to be the norm. That process has to some extent stopped. And I think it's quite important that your generation should recommence that process and should recognize your legacy, not as the legacy of an apartheid criminal regime, but as also the legacy of a heroic process of indigenization which caused you to butt heads with a massive colonial power. And instead of asserting yourself as an alternate colonial power, the way Ian Smith or Idi Amin did, you have carried on creating institutions which you believe reflect South African reality. And I think you now have all the equipment and all the freedom to assert this practice in an inclusive way and to lead, in some respects, this process of decolonization and indigenization of norms. You know, that would be very unpopular for me to say this with the left, whatever. I really don't care, because the left in this country has proved its irrelevance as much as the right, and certainly the center has no relevance. So it's very important to assert practices on the basis of things which have worked, and it's very important to counter the colonial history and this kind of paralysis that comes from feeling the norms of your society originate elsewhere, and you have to keep polishing them and keeping them in pristine condition, and going to England and topping them up and watching Monty Python and reading the Weekly Mail. So that would be my task for the males in this room. You have access to extraordinary, adventurous process that certainly had its downsides, but these are the downsides and the liabilities of any attempt to indigenize norms. The danger of an ethnocentricity or a gynocentricity or a whatever centricity is always there. That is something which has to be managed in a pragmatic universe, in which we are worse off in a non-pragmatic universe, thinking we're in a modernist, rational, neutral, objective universe, because in fact we have no tools to manage it, because we don't see it as a liability. We think our neutrality is assured by the subject, which we're always polishing like a mirror, and by our direct access to nature. And we think that we keep our knowledge neutral, objective, rational, etc., by means of this whole mirror, whatever it is, pair of levers. Once that collapses, an additional responsibility falls upon us. All our concepts are historicist. They're all handed to us by a previous generation. We're all standing on something which we didn't invent. We all have to explicate the norms that are the basis of what we're able to do right now. They are all passed on from someone. And it's very important to receive those norms from where they came, understand their liability, and not reject them and believe there is some kind of liberal democratic neutrality that you can automatically replace them with by going out and voting DA, or being guilty and beating yourself up, or whatever. That is simply a dissipative activity. So that's always been my comment whenever I've spoken on the Afrikaans language campuses. I've said you, in fact, have started a process of indigenization here, which is an essential post-colonial moment, but you have left it in the lurch. What is it going to take not to leave it in the lurch? My second point is, my final point, is that you're all at that moment in your careers where you're about to be ejected from the nursery school of the university, where all the norms are made explicit because knowledge is reproduced around these norms, and it's really a little kind of paradise of normativity, and everything is explicit. It's like a liquid diet. You can't chew things, you haven't got teeth yet. And you're being thrown into a world where it's not clear where the norms are, where you will end up. You're likely to end up in the worst side of the practice that employs you. You will simply become slaves. You'll wonder why you studied. If you wanted to become a slave, you could have simply thrown yourself on the mercy of human trafficking at the age of 16 while you were still young and fresh and had some sort of value, or your kidneys were still kind of worth something on the organ market. So it's quite important that you see yourselves in very historicist terms, that you see yourself as a group, that you form a group, that you support one another as a group, and that you assert yourselves as that group. Don't try and assert yourselves in the neutral framework that the profession likes to think of itself in, because that framework doesn't exist. You need to marshal your resources, and marshal the resources of the present moment. You need to marshal the weakness of the profession, which is untransformed and therefore going to get a real hiding from government, whether from Blade on the education side or from public works on the support side, on the utilization side. The profession is so untransformed that it represents a national demographic in reverse. It's 80% white. Now, you need to become something other than a casualty in that situation. You need to provide the means from within of seizing and transforming that profession and making it everything it can be, and not receiving the problems of your elders and have them passed on to you so you become simple scapegoats. By the time you're established as architects, everyone's going to want to pull the profession apart for its elitism. You need to establish its absolute relevance beyond anything that has been attempted before. Now, in doing that, you have to understand that this practice is strung together by everyday deeds, by little strands. There's no big super strand holding the rope together. You face a situation where architecture has been poorly managed in relation to government. Government's the big spender. It's been poorly managed through the Department of Public Works. The Department of Public Works is a shambles. Forgive me. But at the moment, there is another offering from government, another home, another place where you can relate to the economy or to the future of this country, and that is through creative industries. The policy of creative industries is fiercely supported. It's been a success story economically all around the world. It has strong elements of indigenization built in, etc. Now let's look at the situation. You go through this door, and it's called Public Works, Built Environment Policy, etc. There are 1,000 engineers standing in front of you, dominating the conversation. Behind them are another 1,000 developers saying money is tight. Behind them are financiers and banks saying we haven't got any money, too much risk. Behind them is government saying which of these turkeys can we subsidize? Where do you fit in? You fit in nowhere. You fit in simply as a pastry chef, putting little rosettes on something left over by the engineers, right? So now, do you want to be a fifth-class citizen in heaven, or do you want to rule in hell, right? Here's where you would form a genuine practice, a genuine counter. Do you want to be the big grandmother of all creative industries? Because after all, you've been going for 3,000 years. You've been providing something which transacts intellectual property in a very sophisticated way and effectively transacts it. You are the model of every successful creative industry. Do you want to move into that space and be the big dog and reorganize that space around the centrality of architecture? Because you have such strong institutions, such clarity and such a track record, you would come in there like Satan among the angels. On the other hand, you could come here and look for crumbs from the engineers. And who wants to be part of public works? All they do is regulate you. They're just your dog license. Why not refocus yourselves on creative industries and say, we want to come here and do something for our country and make creative industries a success and be at the center of it and define it, determine its norms, determine its vocabulary, determine the way it asserts itself, and bring other creative industries along with you into growth. After all, in the Growth Path document, it's tourism, green economy, creative industries and agriculture that are the drivers of development and growth in this country until 2030. Not a mention of built environment and infrastructure, which is very much a catch-up and patch-up operation. There's nothing excluding you from that action. You are still part of that built environment sector. But what if you decided to hijack creative industries and remold the whole conversation around your generation and interact with government and prove transformation in a creative industries context? You'd win, of course, but it would take a certain audacity and a certain different way of thinking. Now, if you were to attempt something like that, you would become committed Rortians and pragmatists overnight. You would see exactly the strength of these instruments. You would see what it means to build something up such that it casts a shadow over the opposition and sickens it. You would see that this is an everyday practice of warfare, where you don't attack the enemy, but you simply build something amongst yourselves and then roll it out into the public domain. And it becomes the benchmark, it becomes the alternative, and everything else around it can't assert itself as the center anymore. That, I think, would happen if architecture of your generation were to make an effort right now not to go your separate ways, but in fact to make an all-out assault on the creative industry space and redefine the architecture of your generation in that space, the way in which modernism in the 1920s defined itself as a unique kind of architecture within the space of industrial production and mass housing. You have the same opportunity. But for the headspace to do that, you must not be jinxed by the idea that there is some canonical way in which things are, because things aren't a certain way. We are the makers of reality, including maybe even the makers of the gods. And that is the pragmatist bottom line. So thank you. Do you have any questions? No questions? What is wrong with this class? Huh? Why do you never have questions? It's actually alarming. It makes me wonder. You have to read the Rorty piece and you have to read the James Springs piece. Otherwise, this will not make sense. And the Rorty piece, you need to read it twice. You really do need to read it twice. Because the first time you read a book, the book reads you. It just highlights your bigotry. You've got to somehow get that engagement with that piece. It's a it's an extraordinary expression by a very prolific philosopher and public intellectual of his position in one very beautiful account. And he doesn't talk about himself, he talks about the issues facing women in America at that time. Very compelling but very perfect introduction to what pragmatism can be and could be for you. So yeah. You have no questions. Are you all getting along with this process so far? Yes, hallelujah.
You spoke about the sort of reassertion of indigenization of culture, because of colonialism, and then you specifically addressed the male gender.
Well, not because I think males are any better at it, because I'm feeling sorry for the males this evening, because all the examples have kind of caricatured them as these kind of ultra-modern, neutral, rational, falsely universalizing individuals. And I'm saying to them, there's hope for you as well, because you've come off a very specific historical process, very successful process of demolishing reliance on external norms. A norm from England is as bad as a universal norm if we believe there are like norms of rationality or justice to be had somewhere in reason. It's as bad, it's as oppressive. This kind of process can only happen if you can transact the norms right here, right down here, not in some heaven of ideas or in some perfect Oxford, Cambridge, or whatever. So the process of trying to invent and bring norms and experiment with norms. Sometimes the norms of German Romanticism in the early nationalist period and whatever. It doesn't matter what the content was. The content can be as bizarre. And I think the content was bizarre, to be honest. But the gesture, the process of bringing the norms within the control of institutions that are South African and focused on South African issues, that I think is incomparable and is lacking in so many post-colonial situations. And in fact, South Africa's difficulty in recognizing itself as a post-colonial society is partly due to the success of your grandfathers in bringing the norms out of that colonial space and trying in a admittedly Marx Brothers, Three Stooges crazy way sometimes, exaggerated way, to bring those norms and implement them. And sometimes they wanted to jump out and go somewhere else. Sometimes they ended up with Hitler, who seemed to be a stronger home for them or whatever. But the fact is, they got brought back. The very fact is you've got a big head of steam, you've got a head start in a very necessary process. So I'm saying that males from this tradition have got institutions all around them which have broken with that universalizing default assumption of a neutral rationality, scholarly neutrality, all that stuff. You know, that forms such a big part of the British settler population's self-image. So I'm saying males don't feel excluded, but it's a job for all of you. You know, and probably women will do the job better because women are more inclusive thinkers. But anyway, that's a bigoted generalization from me.
I was wondering whether there's a successful example of someone who sort of created a new strand to overpower the colonial ruler at the time.
Yes, I would say the people of Vietnam who gave hiding to America were a very remarkable example of how a kind of nationalism beat imperialism, and how that nationalism sort of spoke almost in a ventriloquist way through communism at the time. But the minute it became an ultra-nationalist kind of position. So I would say that the people of Vietnam beat the Americans and the French and anybody else before them. So that is a good example. There are many examples. Contemporary China.
Do you think that any sort of substantiated change from norms would be seen as progress then in a way?
I'd say polemically, you can always, once you start asserting these norms strongly, publicly, effectively, and their presence cannot be denied, which the presence of women cannot be denied today, then the norms or the goods, the public goods of your opponent start to seem evil. Every evil is just a previous good that's been superseded. So they start to seem evil. So there is certainly that sense of distancing yourself from something. But in fact, this thing is becoming less and less transactable as a public good. But in terms of progress, apart from that comparative example, I'm not sure that progress is a relevant measure, because progress seems to always be progress towards either a clarified concept in mind or progress towards the facts of reality. It's hard to articulate progress here, but I would say that progress seems to work backwards in a pragmatic situation. The more access you have to the past, to the historic framework, to the subsoil, and the more fine distinctions you can make, the way, say, somebody like Michel Foucault makes these very fine distinctions, or his idol Friedrich Nietzsche makes his genealogical siftings. I'd say the more distinctions you can make in the subsoil historically, the more the situation progresses, the more you can bring a background assumption, as Taylor calls it, to bear on establishing your norms. But it is warfare. I've got to go, yeah, that's right. Not at all. Any more questions? Good, well, thank you very much for your patience, your attention. I'll see you on Thursday.